Oberleutnant Kurt Halvorsen commanded 6 Panzer Roman IV on the morning of December 19th, 1944, and by noon he had lost 4 of them to a stretch of stone and river no wider than a football field, defended, according to every estimate his own reconnaissance had provided, by a single understrength American company. He wrote in his tank's logbook that evening, in handwriting his adjutant later described as uncharacteristically unsteady. 30 men held this bridge against 6 tanks. I do not know how to explain this to my superiors in a way that will not sound like an excuse. It was not an excuse. It was simply what happened. He underlined the last sentence once, then closed the logbook, and it would be 3 days before he wrote in it again. Halvorsen was, by the standards of the Wehrmacht's armored corps, an unremarkable success story, competent, promoted on schedule, respected by the men under his command, without being especially beloved by them. He had commanded tanks in the Soviet Union for 2 years before being transferred west in the autumn of 1944, and in that time he had developed the kind of hard, practical confidence that came from having survived engagements that had killed most of the officers he'd trained alongside. His theory of infantry, formed over those 2 years on the Eastern Front, was straightforward and had never once failed to predict an outcome. Infantry without armor support could delay a tank assault. They could not stop one. A well-handled anti-tank gun might account for a single vehicle if the crew was skilled and lucky in equal measure. But 6 tanks, properly employed, with infantry support of their own, represented a mathematical certainty against any position that lacked its own armor or substantial artillery. Halvorsen had proven this theory correct on a dozen occasions in Russia, and he had no reason, arriving in the Ardennes in December of 1944, to expect the arithmetic to change. He had been given, for the operation on the 19th, what his own intelligence described as a soft objective, a stone bridge over a modest river, held by what aerial reconnaissance suggested was a single depleted infantry company, no more than 30 effectives, without armor, without significant artillery support, and reportedly low on ammunition following several days of continuous retreat. The bridge itself was tactically essential. It was the last viable crossing for his battalion's armor in the sector, the only route that would allow his division to reach a fuel depot before Allied forces could either destroy it or move it beyond reach. Halvorsen expected the crossing to take, at most, 90 minutes. He would later write that this estimate was not born of arrogance, but of experience, the honest calculation of an officer who had seen the same equation solved the same way many times before, and who had no reason yet to suspect that this particular version of the problem contained a variable his experience had never accounted for. Company C, 3rd Battalion, 214th Infantry Regiment, was not on paper a unit built for the kind of stand it would make on the morning of December 19th. It was a conventional rifle company, raised in the summer of 1943 from draftees and volunteers drawn largely from small towns across the American Midwest, trained according to standard infantry doctrine, and equipped, by December of 1944, with nothing more exotic than rifles, a handful of bazookas, 2 remaining anti-tank guns, and the accumulated experience of 5 months of continuous combat since landing in France. What set the company apart, according to the account later assembled by its surviving officers, was not any specialized training or unusual equipment. It was a single decision made months earlier by its commanding officer, Captain Daniel Ors Bear Or N, spelled Osborne in most surviving records, a decision that would prove, on the morning the tanks arrived, to matter more than any weapon in the company's inventory. Osborne had lost, in the company's first major engagement in Normandy, nearly a third of his original strength in a single afternoon, in a hedgerow position that had been ordered held, at all costs, by a battalion staff that Osborne, in a letter never sent to his wife, but preserved among his effects, described as men who write those words from a map table 40 miles behind the line, where the cost is a phrase rather than a fact. He had watched, in the aftermath of that engagement, replacement soldiers arrive to fill the gaps in his ranks young, inexperienced, and in several cases visibly unprepared for what they were about to be asked to do. Rather than simply integrating these replacements into existing squads and hoping experience would transfer by proximity, as was standard practice throughout much of the army at the time, Osborne instituted what he called, with characteristic understatement, the pairing system. Every new man was assigned, for his first month in combat, to a veteran of the company's original landing, not as a subordinate, but as a partner whose explicit job was to teach the replacement not tactics, which the army had already taught adequately, but what Osborne described in a training memo circulated to his platoon leaders as the difference between understanding a position should be held and actually believing it in your body when the moment to leave arrives and you don't. The result, according to several surviving veterans interviewed decades later, was a company that had developed, by December of 1944, an unusually deep bench of men capable of independent, disciplined action under exactly the kind of pressure that broke less cohesive units. Staff Sergeant Miller, who led one of the company's rifle platoons, described it this way in a post-war interview. Wasn't that we were braver than anybody else, wasn't that at all. Was that by the time December came around, near about every man in that company had already had it drilled into him, by somebody he trusted, exactly what holding a position actually meant when it stopped being a word in an order and started being the ground under your own boots. Osborne built that into us slow, one replacement at a time, and none of us really understood what he'd built until the morning it mattered. The pairing system had a second, less obvious effect that Osborne himself did not fully anticipate when he introduced it. According to a letter he wrote to a former battalion commander in the months after the war. It created, across the company, a dense web of personal obligation that ran laterally through the ranks rather than simply vertically through the chain of command. A replacement did not merely owe discipline to his sergeant or his captain. He owed something more specific and more difficult to abandon to the particular veteran who had spent a month teaching him, in the mud and the cold and the tedium between engagements, how to survive. By December, nearly every man in the company existed within at least one such relationship, and in many cases several, layered across months of shared replacements and rotations. Osborne wrote of this with the same understatement that characterized most of his surviving correspondence. I did not set out to build an obligation machine. I set out to keep replacements alive long enough to become veterans themselves. But I have come to believe the obligation was the thing that mattered most, in the end, more than any skill I was actually trying to teach. The engagement began, according to both American and German accounts, with a probing action rather than a full assault. Havosin sent a single tank forward, escorted by a squad of infantry, to test the bridge's defenses before committing his main force standard procedure against what he still believed to be a token defense. The probe was stopped within the first 200 meters. Corporal Elwood Hastings, manning one of the company's two remaining anti-tank guns from a concealed position in a stone barn overlooking the approach road, destroyed the lead tank with his second round, the first having struck the vehicle's frontal glacis without penetrating. Havosin's own report, filed later that day, notes the loss with clinical brevity. Advance element engaged and destroyed at approximately 0615 by what is assessed as a single well-concealed anti-tank weapon. Position not otherwise identified, proceeding with main force as planned. Havosin committed 3 tanks to the main assault at 0700, supported by the bulk of his available infantry. The attack was, by his own later admission, executed exactly according to doctrine armor, advancing under infantry cover, infantry advancing under armor's suppressive fire, each element supporting the other in the coordinated rhythm that had carried German armored operations across half of Europe. It did not work. Hastings's second anti-tank gun, positioned on the opposite bank and previously undetected, engaged the lead tank from an oblique angle that its crew, focused on the barn position across the river, had not accounted for. The tank was disabled, though not destroyed, its track severed, blocking the narrow approach road for the vehicles behind it. What followed, according to Feldwebel Anton Bruckner, who commanded the infantry element supporting the assault, was not the kind of defense his training had prepared him to expect. The Americans did not simply hold their positions and fire at whatever presented itself. They coordinated. Fire would begin from one position, and precisely as we adjusted to suppress it, fire would begin from a second position we had not previously located, timed in a way that suggested deliberate signal rather than coincidence. I have fought disorganized defenders. I have fought fanatical defenders who simply would not stop regardless of casualties. This was neither. This was something closer to a single mind operating through 30 separate rifles. The second assault was called off at 0745, with one tank destroyed outright, one disabled and blocking the road, and German infantry casualties that Bruckner's own report estimated at significant, though I confess I did not have leisure to count precisely while attempting to remain alive. Halvorsen, recognizing that a direct assault along the main approach road was proving costlier than anticipated, ordered a flanking maneuver, sending 2 tanks and a reinforced infantry platoon along a secondary track that his maps indicated would allow them to cross the river at a shallower point roughly 600 meters upstream and approach the bridge's defenders from the rear. The maneuver very nearly succeeded. It failed, according to the account later reconstructed from survivor testimony on both sides, because of a single decision made by Private First Class Louis Camerano, a 19-year-old rifleman who had been assigned, as part of a 2-man outpost, to watch the exact crossing point Halvorsen's maps had identified. Camerano's partner was wounded in the opening moments of the German advance. Rather than withdrawing to report the flanking movement, which would have required abandoning his wounded comrade or leaving the crossing point entirely unobserved, Camerano remained in position, treating the wound as best he could between intervals of aimed rifle fire, and held the crossing point alone for the 22 minutes. It took a relief squad to arrive after his repeated radio calls finally reached the company command post. Lieutenant Erich Van, who led the flanking element, wrote afterward, "We encountered a crossing point our reconnaissance had assessed as unguarded, sustained and accurate rifle fire from what we initially estimated, based on the volume of fire, as a squad strength position. We later determined this fire had originated from a single soldier, alone, tending to a wounded comrade throughout the engagement without once abandoning his position. I do not have an adequate professional vocabulary for this. My training did not include a category for it. The flanking element was delayed long enough for reinforcements to arrive and drive them back across the river, the maneuver abandoned by 0915. Halvorsen's final assault, launched at 1000 with his 3 remaining operational tanks and the bulk of his surviving infantry, represented, in his own later account, every resource available to me committed to a single objective that should, by any reasonable calculation, have already fallen 3 hours earlier. The assault reached the near bank of the river, and for a period Halvorsen's report describes only as several minutes of close engagement, appeared genuinely close to breaking through. American ammunition, particularly for the anti-tank guns, was running critically low. Captain Osborne's own log, recovered after the engagement, notes that Hastings's crew had, by 1015, fewer than 4 rounds remaining for their weapon. What halted the final assault, according to both American testimony and Halvorsen's own report, was not a change in tactics or the arrival of reinforcements. It was, in Halvorsen's words, a refusal on the part of the defenders to acknowledge that the position had, by every measure available to a professional soldier, become untenable. Fire did not diminish as ammunition presumably grew scarce. If anything, it became more disciplined, more precisely aimed, as though the defenders had made a collective decision to make every remaining round matter more than the one before it. Halvorsen ordered a general withdrawal at 1030, having lost 4 of his 6 tanks, and by his own estimate, nearly a third of his supporting infantry, without having gained control of a single meter of the bridge itself. Corporal Elwood Hastings, the anti-tank gunner who destroyed the first tank and disabled the second, was 26 years old, older than most of the company's other enlisted men, a former machinist from a manufacturing town in Ohio who had, according to his platoon leader, a way of talking about the gun, the way another man might talk about a tool he'd used his whole life like it was just another piece of equipment that did a job, nothing more. Asked years later by a regimental historian what he had been thinking as he engaged the lead tank at close range, with no realistic prospect of relocating if the shot failed to penetrate, Hastings gave an answer notable for its almost complete absence of drama. Wasn't thinking much of anything, tell you the truth. Just doing the math the way you're trained to do it, angle, distance, where to put the round. Gun doesn't care if you're scared. Neither does the tank coming at you, so didn't seem like there was much use in being scared myself. Not right then. Time for that was later, and I was plenty scared later, once it was done. Private First Class Louis Camerano, who held the flanking crossing point alone while tending his wounded partner, was interviewed for the same regimental history project nearly 3 decades after the war. He described the 22 minutes he spent alone at the crossing with a plainness that the historian conducting the interview noted, in his own annotations, seemed almost deliberately unremarkable. Wasn't really a decision to stay, not the way people think about decisions. Bill was hit, and somebody needed to watch that crossing, and I was the only somebody there. Didn't seem like there was another option worth considering. I've had people ask me since if I was afraid I'd die out there alone. Guess I must have been. Don't remember it that way, though. Remember mostly just reloading and checking on Bill and reloading again. Camerano's partner, Private William Reyes, survived his wound and was evacuated later that morning. In a brief statement given to a war correspondent shortly afterward, Reyes offered what may be the single most direct account of what Camerano's action had actually meant in practice. I was down, couldn't do much of anything, and Louis just kept working patch me up a little, fire a few rounds, patch me up a little more. Never once talked about pulling back, not that I heard. I owe that man my life, and I expect I'm not the only one in that company who could say something like it about somebody else. The report that traveled furthest through the German chain of command came not from Halvorsen directly, but from Oberst Wilhelm Forst, the regimental commander to whom Halvorsen's battalion reported, who included an extended account of the engagement in a broader post-action assessment submitted to divisional headquarters and later recovered from captured records. Forst's assessment, unusually candid for a document intended for superior officers, devotes several pages to the bridge engagement specifically. I have reviewed Oberleutnant Halvorsen's report with some care, in part because my initial reaction upon reading it was skepticism the figures involved. 6 tanks against a single understrength company, without significant artillery or air support on the American side, seemed difficult to credit at face value. I have since confirmed the essential facts through independent reconnaissance and through interrogation of infantry personnel who participated in the assault, and I find myself unable to identify any error in Halvorsen's account. The defending company held its position for 4.5 hours against a force that should, by every principle of combined arms doctrine that this army has spent years refining, have overwhelmed it within the first hour. He continues, in a passage that a divisional intelligence officer later flagged for wider circulation. I do not believe the explanation lies in superior weaponry, of which the Americans in this instance had remarkably little, nor in numerical parity, which did not exist. I believe the explanation lies in something considerably harder to counter through any adjustment of tactics or equipment, a degree of internal cohesion within the defending unit that allowed 30 men, most of them without extensive prior combat experience, to fight as a coordinated whole for 4.5 hours under conditions that would, in most units I have commanded or observed, have produced individual soldiers making individual decisions to preserve their own lives well before the 4th hour arrived. I do not have a satisfying tactical countermeasure to recommend for this quality. I am not certain one exists. Forst closes his assessment with a line that his own superior, reviewing the document, apparently found unusually blunt for a formal military report, though it was allowed to stand unedited in the version later recovered by Allied intelligence. We lost 4 tanks and a bridge crossing essential to this sector's operations, to a company that should not, by any calculation available to me, have been capable of denying us. I recommend this engagement be studied specifically for what it reveals about the limits of doctrine when confronted with a defending unit whose cohesion cannot be measured by any figure in our own order of battle. Kurt Halvorsen survived the war, was captured in the spring of 1945, and spent just over a year in an Allied prisoner camp before returning to a country attempting, in its own fractured way, to make sense of what it had done and what had been done to it. He rarely discussed the bridge engagement in later life, according to a nephew interviewed decades afterward for a regional historical project, with one notable exception. Late in his life, asked directly by a graduate student researching armored operations, in the Ardennes campaign, why that particular engagement had apparently stayed with him more than others from a war that had given him no shortage of difficult memories. Halvorsen reportedly considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I have thought about the mathematics of that morning many times in the years since," he said. 6 tanks, 30 men. Every principle of the profession I had spent years learning said the outcome was not in question. I have concluded, after much consideration, that the mathematics were not wrong. What was wrong was my understanding of what 30 men could be to one another, under the right circumstances, built the right way, over enough months, by the right officer. That is not a variable that appears in any tactical manual I was ever issued. I do not believe it can be taught quickly. I believe it can only be built, slowly, one soldier at a time, by someone who understands exactly what he is building and why. I encountered, on that bridge, the result of someone who understood this far better than I did, and I have never entirely stopped thinking about what that means. The bridge itself held for the remainder of the campaign, reinforced 2 days later by elements of a relieving division. But the 4.5 hours, during which 30 men and 2 anti-tank guns denied 6 tanks, a crossing essential to the German advance, became, within the regiment's own informal history, the engagement by which every later action was quietly measured. Captain Osborne, asked after the war what he believed had actually made the difference that morning, gave an answer that several of his surviving officers remembered well enough to repeat in later interviews, nearly word for word. "Wasn't the guns. Guns ran dry near the end, near about. Wasn't the ground. Either plenty of good ground gets given up every day of a war like that one. Was the men, and what they'd already decided about each other, long before that morning ever arrived. You build that slow and quiet, and nobody notices you're building it. Right up until the morning, it's the only thing standing between your position and 6 tanks that have every reason to expect you'll fold. We didn't fold. That's the whole of it. That's all it ever was." Years later, at a small regimental reunion, attended by fewer than a dozen surviving veterans of the company, someone asked Hastings, by then an old man with a machinist's hands gone soft with age, whether he ever thought about that morning on the bridge. He reportedly considered the question the way he seemed to consider most things, without hurry, and then pointed across the room to where Camerano was standing, deep in conversation with a man who had once been William Ray's grandson, there in his grandfather's place. "Think about it plenty," Hastings said. "Mostly I think about how none of it would have amounted to a thing without every other man in that company doing his own piece of it, same as I did mine. Wasn't one hero that morning. Wasn't even 30. Was one company doing one job together. That's the part people forget to ask about mostly. That's the part that actually mattered."